Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We're happy to have you here as part of this next hour session together on intergenerational connections and conversations. If you'd like to add your name into the chat and where you're joining us from, we would love to see where everybody's located today.
No, they don't. They're just putting my picture on. Here we go. No, I was from him. There it is.
I'm not.
Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We're happy that you could be here and spend this hour with us. We'd love to see where people are joining from, so we can check the chat and see where everybody's located.
And the connection they have with the conflict in the Middle East.
If everybody could put themselves on mute, that would also be helpful. Just so you know, so it's not distracting to everybody. So thank you so much for that. And we'll get started in just a few seconds. We have somebody in Yorkshire, UK, New Hampshire, Missouri, Canada, New Jersey, Maryland, all over. This is awesome. So exciting to see people from all around the world.
Right. All right, should we go ahead and get going, guys?
Sure.
All right.
Yep.
Well, welcome to How to Have an Intergenerational Conversation, a collaboration between Changing the Narrative and Linkages Connects. Before we start on our content, I would like to invite Diego to give us our language justice introduction and explain how we turn on interpretation. Alexa, next slide.
Thanks, Rachel. Can you hear me? My audio okay?
Yes.
Great. So hi, everyone. I'll get started with the instructions in English and then I'll repeat them in Spanish. Así que hola a todos y todas. Voy a comenzar dando las instrucciones en inglés y luego las repito en español. So my name is Diego Pons. I'm here today on behalf of the Community Language Cooperative, the CLC. We also have Dan Lasher, the sign language interpreter today. Thank you for having us today at your meeting, where the organizers of the meeting made a commitment towards language justice so that people can participate and engage in the language of their heart, meaning the language they feel most comfortable in. We'll use simultaneous interpretation for English and Spanish today. And once I finish saying this in English and after I repeat it in Spanish, we'll start the interpretation at that moment. And once interpretation is on, you'll be able to see that globe icon that says interpretation there in the bottom right-hand corner of your computer screen. I'll ask you to please select the globe icon when it appears on the screen, and please select your preferred language. And if you're joining today's meeting on your cell phone or your tablet, please be on the lookout for the More button or the 3 dots button to select your preferred language this other way. So if you're not fully bilingual, strongly encourage you to select your preferred language so you can use interpretation in case anyone were to speak in the opposite language. And if you're bilingual, then just feel free to listen to everyone in the original language. As always, a special asking I have for the English-speaking audience, just please pay attention to the speed in which you're speaking. Spanish is about 20% longer than English. Just please make sure you're speaking at a conversational pace like this, and please make sure you don't pick up your reading speed. So thank you so much for that. Buenos días a todos y a todas, o buenas tardes. Mi nombre es Diego Pons, estoy aquí de parte de la Cooperativa Comunitaria de la Justicia del Lenguaje, el CLC, también con el otro intérprete, Dan Lasher. Muchas gracias por invitarnos hoy a su reunión, donde vamos a comprometernos a servir la justicia del lenguaje. Eso significa que queremos crear un espacio para que todas las personas puedan participar e involucrarse en el idioma de su corazón, en el idioma en el que todas las personas se sientan más cómodas. Vamos a utilizar hoy la interpretación simultánea aquí en Zoom, en inglés y en español, para la reunión de hoy. Cuando yo termine de decir esto, se va a activar la interpretación y ya cuando esté activada la interpretación, usted va a poder observar ese icono del globo de la Tierra que dirá interpretación allá abajo en la derecha de su pantalla. Por favor, asegúrese de elegir el icono del globo de la Tierra y por favor, elija su idioma preferido. Pero si usted está asistiendo hoy a la reunión en su celular o en su tableta, por favor, busque las opciones que dicen More, que quiere decir más en inglés, o posiblemente el botón de 3 puntos para que pueda seleccionar su idioma preferido de esta otra manera. Si usted no es completamente bilingüe, yo le voy a aconsejar que seleccione su idioma preferido para que pueda utilizar la interpretación cuando alguien está hablando en el otro idioma. Y si usted sí es bilingüe, siéntase libre de escuchar a todos hoy en su idioma original. Muchas gracias.
Okay, I have turned on interpretation. All right. Thank you, Diego, for that introduction. We at both Linkages and Changing the Narrative prioritize accessibility and inclusion. And a piece of that is being able to provide interpretation in, at this point, 2 languages, but we hope to do more. And as you will see on our slides, we have also translated those into Spanish. Closed captioning should also be on. And please, if you have other suggestions for how we can be more inclusive or accessible in the future, we want to hear them. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. Alexa, next slide, please. This is our journey today. We started with our language justice overview, and next we'll be moving into an introduction to our speakers. So I will tell you who I am and our other 2 speakers. And then we're going to focus on 2 pieces. One is the why, and that's where we'll be introducing both Changing the Narrative and Linkages Connects. And that's the why of intergenerational conversations. We love all of this interest in how do we actually have these conversations. And so that's where the majority of our time is going to be spent today, is focusing on the how. Next slide. So 3 of us will be taking you through that journey today. The first, I am very proud to present or to introduce our presenter, Chris Gierken, who is the one of the co-directors of Changing the Narrative. Sarah Brindle, who is the other co-director of Changing the Narrative, is also here behind the scenes on this webinar. Chris developed the Age-Friendly Healthcare Initiative and leads the Intergenerational Conversation Campaign for Changing the Narrative. In addition to, and we all wear many hats, being an adjunct instructor at Metropolitan State University of Denver, teaching on aging and society. She's a frequent speaker and passionate advocate, as you all will hear, and you've probably heard before, for age inclusivity. Our other speaker, Haley Sanner, who will be taking us through the majority of our content today focused on how, also wears multiple hats. She is the Healthy Aging Program Manager at the Colorado Health Network, promoting improved quality of life and social connections for older adults aging with HIV. And she's also the co-creator of Collective Healing Through Art, which is a program of Linkages Connects. She's worked in the aging field across the world, developing a deep specialization in social isolation and emotional well-being. And finally, me. I'm Rachel Cohen, also wearing multiple hats. I am the executive director and creator of Linkages Connects, which is an intergenerational initiative, and founder and CEO of Aging Dynamics consulting firm. We work nationally to strengthen the capacity of organizations to address diverse challenges of creating and sustaining healthy, age-friendly communities. My background is in community planning and social work, and so that's my passion for building communities that are supportive, engaging, and equitable places for people to grow up and grow older. Next slide. I'm going to hand this off to Chris to get us started on our why and give us an overview of Changing the Narrative.
Thanks so much, Rachel. Next slide, please. It's great to be here with everybody. So the why to all of this, why intergenerational conversations and why they're so important. So from the work that we do at Changing the Narrative, everything is focused on educating people and raising awareness about ageism and the negative impacts it has on all of us, all ages. And so from that perspective that we have at Changing the Narrative, we view having these conversations with people of all ages focused on ageism and aging and just what it means to be whatever age you're at or have been is a way to help us break down the stereotypes and the myths. And the definition of ageism that we use is from the World Health Organization, which is stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination directed towards someone based on age. And when we come together of all different ages and have conversations specifically and deliberately about age and ageism, it reduces our ageist beliefs and habits of thought. So it's a great opportunity for us to change the way we understand age if we have any kind of misconceptions about what it means to be of different ages or the age that we're at right now. So these three little pictures showed about that it's an opportunity to develop our shared understanding about the harmful effects of ageism on all of us at all ages. When we talk about ageism, it gets us thinking about what we can do to help reduce it and change our own beliefs if they are leaning in ageist ways. And ultimately, all the work that we do at Changing the Narrative ends with action. We want to motivate and inspire people to find ways that they can take action in small ways or big ways, whatever fits who you are and what you're doing. But it takes action. We can't just complain that ageism exists. We actually have to do things about it. And so when we have these conversations, that's a really powerful, actionable step that we can take to addressing it. Next slide, please. So Changing the Narrative started back in 2018. It was founded by Janine Vanderberg. And between 2018 and 2022, we held 295 workshops with over 17,000 people from around the world just in those 4 years. And this year, we're seeing even more momentum. It's really picking up lots more of attention around the world on this topic, which is very encouraging to us because it means this is like it's starting to change, and that gives us such great hope. So next slide, please. And the work that we do comes from the information that came out of a global campaign to combat ageism from the World Health Organization and United Nations back in 2021. And they found in their research that there is specific evidence-based strategies that can help us reduce ageism. And they are education, intergenerational connections, and policy and law. So these that you see on the screen represent work that we have done and do at Changing the Narrative. And first, you'll see Ending Ageism Together. That's different presentations that we do where it's kind of just this overview of what ageism looks like for all of us of different ages. And we do presentations and workshops on that. We have our Age-Friendly Workplace initiative, which is led by Janine Vanderberg, about age discrimination in the workplace. There's Age-Friendly Healthcare, which is the one that I lead, which is taking a look at ageism in healthcare settings. And we also are happy to do customized workshops on what might fit your organization or your group. So reach out anytime and we can talk about that. On the intergenerational side of things, we created a toolkit, which I'll talk more about in depth later. So I won't go into it now. And we did a PBS series in Colorado where we took people from different sectors of all ages and we talked about age, ageism, and aging and what that means and from different perspectives, which was really, really exciting. And that's on our website. And we also have worked with different universities on research projects with students. And then the policy and law side of it, we've been involved with different organizations to help address bills and get bills passed that are about age and age discrimination and ageism in different various ways. So those are some examples of what we've worked on the political side of things.
Hi, are you on? Okay.
Next slide, please. And also the work that we do focuses on strategic communications. And so in these bullets on this slide, you'll see examples of various types of communications that we use to help get our messages out there into the world. And we've had coverage in over 150 media outlets. And you can see all the different bullets here of how we have made an impact. But our mailing list now at this point, email list is over 6,000 people around the world. And it continues to grow. So we think that's pretty exciting. And we encourage all of you and to share the information about us with your friends and colleagues, because the more we get this information out there, the better on helping to change it. Next slide, please. And another aspect to our work is innovative public campaigns. And these are some examples of some of the ones that we have done. And one is about real photos, where we ask people to share photos of people of different ages. And rather than using models or paid people to have these kind of staged photos, we want real photos of real people of different ages. And our birthday card campaign, we've had 2 rounds of that where we commissioned artists to help to create age-positive birthday cards, because if you've ever noticed in stores, birthday cards tend to lean toward the negative side of aging, and we don't tell us a full true story, and certainly don't lean positive. And then the last graphic there on the right is a crowdsourcing project we did about a year ago. And we asked people what a world without ageism would look like. And an artist created this graphic, which is on our website, and you're all free to share that as well. But these are all examples of conveying messages differently and helping raise awareness about ageism and just talking about it more so we can have a different perspective on age. Next slide, please. And the impact that we've had done evaluations and surveys, and these percentages represent different ways we've had an impact. And we know that we're increasing people's knowledge about ageism. People are beginning to feel more equipped to identify and address ageism when they see it, and also increasing people's understanding about what effective messages mean. And it's hard, we know that this work is hard, but we're here in it all together, and we're here to support you and just keep having these conversations. So thank you for listening to what Changing the Narrative has been involved with.
Next slide. One of the reasons that Linkages Connects was just so excited to be able to collaborate with Changing the Narrative is that key overlap around addressing ageism. And so Linkages Connects, I'm going to kind of go through a quick overview here on just some of the things that we do, but I invite you we'll show some resources later and ways to connect with all of us. There's just so much more than what we can cover. Intergenerational connections can look all different ways. These are just a couple of shots from some Linkages programs, just showing, I think, the joy and the magic that can come with connecting with people from other age groups, and the idea that we can do it in so many different ways, but finding ways to connect around things that bring us each joy is one way. And I'm going to leave the rest of the how to Haley here a little bit later. Alexa, can you go into the next slide? But just wanted to get us primed for what we're talking about. The other thing too that we find is really important is to just start with a definition, because we hear terms like intergenerational and multi-generational used in a variety of different ways. So from our perspective in Linkages, we use the definition that was developed by Generations United, which talks about a couple of key items. One is having a skipped generation. So oftentimes there can be different dynamics that occur when you've got people in generations right next to each other that end up feeling more like a familial dynamic. Not a negative by any means. Those are wonderful dynamics too. We're just talking about when we're creating programs, you can often develop and create programs for having skipped generations because there's different kinds of dynamics and different opportunities to connect. And then the other piece I want to highlight here in the definition is mutually beneficial. And so when we talk about intergenerational connections, it's that mutual benefit. So sometimes we'll hear it's an older person, just giving or sharing their wisdom to a younger person, or a younger person helping with, say, technology. When we talk about conversations here, we're talking with that recognition that everybody has something to share, regardless of your age. We all bring life experiences in really special ways, and that's part of that magic that we're going to talk about how to create today. Next slide. So what is Linkages Connects? We are an organization that is committed to addressing social isolation, loneliness, and ageism. That's our why. And we do that by creating opportunities for meaningful intergenerational connections. And so that means being intentional about how we create those connections. Again, what Haley's going to talk about later today. But really with the recognition that there's so many organizations and individuals, like so many of you here, who are just eager and hungry for connections. You may be shifting in your life from perhaps a workplace where you just always had people of different ages to not having that accessible. And how do you create those connections and why? And these are the whys. We know, and research shows, that intergenerational connections has a direct correlation to reducing loneliness and reducing social isolation or avoiding them altogether. And as Chris referenced earlier, ageism, there's no question. And through linkages, next slide, we are seeking to strengthen the field across the world for offering more of these opportunities. So we can say just put people of different ages in a room and you'll have magic. But really, it takes more than that. And that's like the resources we're going to talk about later. But there are actual barriers to making this happen. And so Linkages was created to be able to address those and just make it so much easier for all of us to create more opportunities so we can have that big impact. These are the 4 barriers that have been proven by research. The first 3 are from Generations United and the Eisner Foundation research in 2018. And then Linkages, which provides a whole lot of technical assistance to individuals and organizations. We also do evaluation. And so we were also looking for what are the other barriers. One is the design. How do we bring people together? The other is demonstrating that impact. The third is funds. That we all know that can stop a program in its tracks. And then the collaboration. It's often really difficult to bring different entities or different age groups together. We speak different languages. We have different goals and different funding opportunities and all of that. It doesn't mean it has to be a barrier, but it can be one. And this is why we created Linkages, so that we could just all stop having these barrier moments and just create together. Next slide. And so how we do this, and I will not go through all of these things, but Linkages has created a whole resource hub online. We'll give you our website here later, but we're intending to help participants like all of us who want intergenerational connections, organizations who want to create more programs, and also the funders. How do they fund all of us? And so we're doing this in a variety of ways. We have a network that you're able to join, and then the whole online hub that we welcome you to explore. Next slide. And so as we move into the how, the meat of what we want to talk about today, I want you to get in your mind all the different places that we can create these connections. So I know I referenced programs at one point, and that's just one way, right? That's, more of a formalized way that's been created, but we know that these connections can happen in everyday instances. So when you're at the recreation center, perhaps in an exercise class or taking an arts and culture class, at the park, grocery store, at work, like I mentioned before, and at health centers, and so many other places. So I invite you to think about that as we start moving into the how. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Haley to keep us going.
Awesome. Chris and Rachel, thanks so much for setting the stage with the why. I'm excited for us to get into the how and how we can make this actionable in our lives. Next slide. So to start us off, kind of want to brainstorm as a group about some different words that we think of when we think of intergenerational connections. And so for those familiar with a word cloud, we're going to use that to kind of display what we all think about as we think about this type of communication. So Rachel is going to put in the chat a link to the Mentimeter. You can click that link and it will allow you to enter a word that comes to mind for you. And we'll share that screen as we kind of get more answers coming. The larger the word, the larger the amount of people that kind of thought of that word at the same time. So to get us started, I can add my word right now. So my word would be storytelling. Rachel and Chris, do you have a word that comes to mind to kind of prompt our audience to think about these things?
Yeah, the word that comes to mind for me is opportunity.
And for me, it's hopefulness.
I love those. All kind of in that collaboration and connection elements. And for those who maybe can't access the Mentimeter, feel free to type any words in the chat as well. So we see some different words coming in. It's bouncing around as people continue to add. But I love that when I'm looking at these different words, I see a mix of kind of the scale of these words. So some of them may connect to some of those positive things like opportunity, wisdom, connection. And some also highlight that they're not always easy, right? I see challenging in there. I see bouncing around, right? Some other things that were related to kind of transitions, which infrequent, things that maybe highlight an opportunity for us to grow and things that we can learn. I also love seeing things like authenticity, understanding, which really leads us into our how and the things that we want to focus on in our how. So I will let us go back to our slides, but this is a really good way to prompt kind of where we are as a community in looking at this type of conversation. So next slide, please. So when I think about the how, I really wanted to frame it along 3 pillars. So intersectionality, listening, and practice. And thinking about communication, I've been really inspired by the work of the Othering and Belonging Institute, led by John A. Powell, where they highlight that so much of our healthy communication, especially when we're kind of interacting along dynamics of othering, like ageism, really rely on us to center belonging. And so the Othering and Belonging Institute created a belonging statement, and I want to highlight 3 of these statements that really mirror the pillars that I want to focus on today. So one says, belonging sees humanity across difference. Belonging is not saming. That is very critical. Belonging invites us to develop our skills in deep listening and curiosity. And lastly, belonging is like a garden that benefits from continual relationship, nurture, and work. So next slide, please. So when we talk about intersectionality, this includes all the different pieces that make up who we are, some of which are listed on this slide, but this is not inclusive of everything that could be part of your identity. Some of these things may be more visible than others. Some of these things may fluctuate while others may stay consistent throughout our life. And the Othering and Belonging Institute has really coined this term of bridging versus breaking. So breaking is when we see these pieces of our identity as ways to kind of separate each other and see us as us versus them. So in an age situation, we're talking about ageism, that us versus them of different generations. And this can increase isolation, harden systems of oppression, and as Chris and Rachel both mentioned, right, have those negative health effects. Next slide, please. Bridging, on the other hand, is when we kind of move from that us versus them into the more inclusive, like we. And it allows us to bring an awareness to our multiple intersecting identities as our many ways of belonging. So ultimately giving us more opportunities to find belonging rather than opportunities to other. And as you can see, research has shown that belonging has shown improvement to our health, both emotionally and physically, in terms of stress responses, as well as healthy attitudes and healthy bodily impacts. So again, I really want to emphasize that we aren't saming, we aren't abandoning our identities, but instead we're creating a healthy dialogue to see each other's humanity. And throughout this, we want to recognize that when we're in conversation with others, that safety should be prioritized. And it's always important to recognize when oppressive systems are entering our conversations in ways that threaten our safety. And so that's something to be aware of and something that we're going to continue to discuss throughout this next section. Also kind of a relevant dialogue that we'll probably share, but there was actually a New York Times article that talked about how having these kind of healthy dialogues, especially when they may be a tough conversation, can have that positive impact on our health as well. So really emphasizing that that doesn't mean kind of not upholding authenticity or not upholding your values when we're bridging, but being able to enter these things with curiosity and that kind of bridging perspective. Next slide, please. So just to get us started, and feel free throughout this to add your thoughts in the chat. Chris and Rachel will kind of help me share some of those, or if there's any questions that come up. But thinking about this aspect of bridging, some of us may be more familiar with that term than others, but are there relationships or situations that you already use bridging in? And then maybe are there other kind of situations where a bridging mindset could be very helpful? I know for myself, I find that I bring this kind of perspective easiest when I'm working as a facilitator in an intergenerational setting. A lot of times I use the word that I am a bridge kind of between the two participants, where I can use my different communication skills to kind of highlight the things that I know about each person or what someone has said, to kind of create that bridging opportunity between participants. That may not always be as easy when I'm in my own family or friendship settings, where I'm not wearing a facilitator hat.
We have a couple people that wrote into the chat, if you'd like to hear. Sandy Z shared that she's been exploring pop culture as a potential gateway. So that's interesting.
I love that. It kind of reminds me too, another one, when Rachel was talking about different settings, right? Some of these may be very deep settings. Sometimes it can be at the grocery store or when we're out and about. And one that I like to use is things about maybe fashion or style. I think a lot of our personality can show up in kind of what we wear and how we wear it. And making comments on that has always kind of opened doors for me. Maybe it opens the story behind the artist that made your earrings. And I think that adds to a lot deeper levels of communications and can show the values that we portray in the way we present ourselves. Next slide, please. So now when we have that kind of framework and mindset of bridging, I want to kind of talk about how we can enact this through using reflective listening skills. So those who may have familiarity with things like motivational interviewing, you'll recognize some of these elements as kind of important ways that we can work with others and kind of show that through our communication. So communication is always a two-way street, right? It takes both parties to engage in this. So all of these dynamics are important for us to recognize for ourselves, as well as in those who we're trying to communicate with. And kind of some of these bridges may be longer than others. Some may be very easy to make, and some may take a lot more time. And so especially when we're working through long bridges, it may cause us to kind of work harder to uphold some of these practices and be able to take kind of breaks along the way. So first off is recognizing that some conversations may cause us to have kind of heightened responses, especially if we are starting to feel unsafe. And this can show up in our body. Sometimes that shows up as tensing. Sometimes you may kind of have a little shake. Sometimes your heart may kind of pound a little bit louder. And so recognizing what does that look like for you, and recognizing, are you still safe in that setting? Or is that something you need to leave immediately? Or is it a moment for you to kind of practice calming your body to continue to engage in this challenging conversation, especially if it is kind of heightening your body in that way. And so a calm body can really help us maintain that bridging perspective and being aware of that, not only for ourselves, but for the other person we're engaging with. So if we see that person we're engaging with start to have some of those physical responses, what can kind of we do to help mirror that? And I love that the next aspect of like, right, looking in a mirror, and it kind of goes both ways, not only with kind of what we're saying, but also our body. That if we are modeling a calm body, that can help the other person that we're communicating with maintain a calmer body and maintain that feeling of safety in our body, and maintain that feeling of being present in the space. And so when we think about reflecting back our answers, this can be a great way for us to center back on listening, where if you're familiar with motivational interviewing, this skill kind of asks us to repeat what we heard before we add our own thoughts. So it allows us to kind of take a moment to not just be thinking about what our response is, but really hear what someone says, reflect it back to them to show them that they feel heard and valued in that situation. Kind of next is our kind of tones, which again goes with that like body heightening, where tough conversations can sometimes get elevated. And we're not trying to tone police, but we want to recognize that when a tone of either ourselves or the other person is getting in the way of our ability to listen. So if we're getting to a point where maybe we're both shouting at each other, are we really still listening to each other? And maybe we're talking past each other and not using some of those skills like reflecting answers back when tones get heightened. So it can just be a cue. That's not always true. For some people, tone may be how you present yourself, and being loud and passionate isn't impacting your listening skills, but for others it may. So something to be aware of. And lastly, I want to think about how we ask questions. If we're asking yes or no questions, we can close off conversations. And so open-ended questions can incite more, and when we continue to ask follow-up questions, that can incite more things that can be helpful. Especially when we're looking to find more points of connections and working through a disagreement, coming from a place of curiosity can really help us move into that space. So kind of using that in combination with the reflection, maybe I heard you say this, what do you mean by that? Rather than kind of jumping to a point of disagreement, but asking for clarification can help us kind of enter that conversation from a bridging perspective. Can we move to the next slide? So I really love this kind of infographic that Beam created, which can be a really great reminder for us to uphold a lot of these practices of both intersectionality and reflective listening, especially when we're getting into tough conversations. So that pause, right? Pause in our body and in our mind and our response, but paying attention to their body thoughts and feelings, assessing what's activating you and how that shows up for you, understanding where the roots of your feelings are coming from, setting boundaries to ensure your safety, and then empathizing with those involved. So going into the next part, in that way to kind of uphold our boundaries, or especially when we are maybe in tougher conversations, or we recognize when the ability to listen, either for ourselves or for others, has become diminished. Boundaries can be a really helpful way for us to remove ourselves maybe from that conversation at a time and come back if it's a conversation we can still safely engage in when we feel like the listening capacity is better. So I love that this really centers us on our values and identifying our need, and then identifying an action that can really relate to that need. So it becomes very tangible and becomes something that centers that bridging, right? When we center a value that may be shared with another person, it can highlight that aspect of bridging. Rachel, would you like to share kind of an example of what this could look like?
Sure. So I really value curiosity and learning about other people's identities and life experiences, and sharing my own. And I need to feel safe and not judged on both what I share and how I ask questions, and want to offer that to the other person I'm talking to. So to make that happen, I like to suggest that we give each other grace for not using the right words, and gently correct or offer suggestions to the other person or alternatives.
Wonderful. I love that kind of that example of calling in versus calling out, for those familiar with that term, especially when that bridging may be a little bit longer, that can be a really good opportunity to teach each other and learn from each other in those moments. Next slide, please. So as we're reflecting on this, I wanted to prompt us to kind of identify things that facilitate deep listening for ourselves, and things that may be barriers to deep listening. So feel free to add any of your thoughts in the chat about things that maybe help you show up to listen deeply. Maybe there are specific relationships or situations that you can do so most easily. and kind of what helps you prepare to listen deeply. So I know for me that sometimes, like I mentioned, when I'm at work, it may be easier for me to naturally utilize these skills. But maybe when I'm in closer relationships, it can be harder to remember to practice these skills because I'm not wearing that facilitator hat. The other times, like maybe when I'm stressed or consumed with other topics, that these can be barriers that kind of prevent me from being able to listen as well. I've also utilized kind of different forms of communication to help me practice these elements of listening in isolation rather than having to do all of them. So for example, if I'm writing back via email or text, I can take a lot more time to respond to something and really use intentional language, really kind of foster that curiosity and that reflective listening in the way that I'm writing. But I don't have to worry about kind of how my body language is happening or my tone or things like that that may have been heightened, especially if I didn't agree with the response. Same thing over the phone. I may still have to work on tone and verbiage, but I don't always have to focus on body language. And so I can practice two of those things at the same time for then when I'm in the moment in person, where I can have to work on all of those things at once. Wonderful. And so lastly, focusing on how we question, how we ask questions. So a lot of times we get asked questions like, how's it going? Or what's up? And those are very kind of vague questions that we don't always know how to enter into. Sometimes we may have kind of canned responses to that. And sometimes we may have to try to think about ways to add detail and continue a conversation beyond just I'm good. So an example of this, a lot of times when you go on a trip, people are like, how was your trip? Something that I have switched for myself is to ask people, what was your favorite meal? Because that type of questioning inspires someone to say a little bit more detail, inspires them to give a context of the scenario, describe the meal, and then allows us to continue to have follow-up questions rather than just saying, it was really great, I loved everything we saw. Because where do you enter in on maybe a week-long trip? A lot of things happened, and it can be hard for the respondent to decide, what am I going to share right then? So more specific questions can give us more insight to that. Rachel or Chris, do either of you have a question you really like to ask?
I've got a suggestion for people. One that I think gets people thinking is to ask someone, what was your maybe favorite moment or memory in elementary school? Something positive that happened.
Love that. Wonderful. So something that to kind of consider is that third pillar is practice. I really like to remind people that these are states, not traits, meaning we are not born with them, and they continue to take practice. And as we may transition to different points in our life, we may have to re-practice and relearn some of these skills. We may have to unlearn skills that we were using before in different situations that may not apply in new situations. And so giving ourselves grace as well as other people grace. A lot of times when I hear people say, oh, someone was really, really grumpy or whatnot, when we know that isolation is impacting so many of us, especially after things like COVID, that we have to think about it in a little bit different way. If someone hasn't been practicing having conversations and having to ask these types of questions, they may come off in a little bit different way, maybe a little terser than they would if they were really well practiced and hadn't been isolated. And just knowing all of the intersections of isolation and emotional well-being, that we want to be aware of that and give each other grace and remind ourselves that we have to practice these things. And sometimes that means practicing by yourselves in the mirror. Sometimes it means talking to yourself kind of in your journal or writing down kind of what you want to say ahead of time before going into conversations. And other times it can be practicing in the moment and giving yourself grace even when we don't do it perfectly. So kind of going forward in your life, taking away kind of what you've learned in this setting, I'd like to kind of discuss what would be some skills that you would like to practice, Maybe there's a specific relationship or situation that you like to practice in. That could be something, a relationship that maybe you feel very comfortable in. I know I have some friends who really enjoy brainstorming. How would I go into this tougher conversation? Can we kind of role play this and practice this out so I feel prepared in that tougher conversation with someone that maybe I don't know as well, or someone that we may disagree on certain things. And then in that kind of vein, who would support you? What do you need to support this? Is it kind of getting you a list of different questions, of different examples of beautiful questions, so you feel prepared with like the ones that are in your back pocket when conversation stalls? Or is it that kind of role playing element of, do you have that person in your life?
So here I just want to share a bit about the work that we've done at Changing the Narrative and the toolkit that we created for intergenerational conversations. And back in 2019, we first created On the Same Page, and it's a downloadable toolkit on our website. And that came about just with our interest in bringing people of all ages together, because we knew that people of all ages experience ageism in different ways, and coming together will help us to mitigate that. And since 2019, we have revised a new one, which I'll get to in a second. But initially, this was a capstone project that I did when I was a student at MSU Denver, getting my master's in health administration. And this ended up taking off. We didn't realize it was going to be so popular when we launched it in 2019, but it ended up reaching people. Next slide, please. Across the country, and in 23 different countries outside of us. So that was 4 years ago, which we were really excited and encouraged about, because it told us that people have an interest in coming together of all ages and having these conversations that are so crucial to helping us toward ending ageism. Next slide, please. And then in September, we relaunched it. We revised the toolkit and just relaunched it this year. And so it's free to all of you to download from our website, and highly encourage you all to check it out. Next slide, please. And since this year, we have reached people in all 50 states, and I think it's like 63 countries now, and all continents. So it's definitely, the awareness is raising about ageism, and with all kinds of campaigns that are out there like ours and many other great ones. So this is an important conversation for all of us to start having. Next slide, please. And this is just an example of part of what's in our toolkit, are different links to some short videos on ageism. We also have several different categories of questions within the toolkit, and you're free to modify the toolkit to fit your groups and the needs and the types of things you want to talk about. But we have different categories like isolation and loneliness, and stereotyping and assumptions. So make it your own. Take the toolkit and make it work for the groups that you're connected with, and use it in the ways. And we'd love to hear about what you're doing with it. So feel free to reach out to us as well. Next slide.
So as we sort of previewed at the beginning, there's a lot of resources, and we know that there's even more beyond this. There's so many wonderful efforts, around the world, and many of you here in the chat have been sharing some of what you're doing too. So that's part of what makes me hopeful too, is that there's just so much we can do together. Linkages is adding to those resources as well, and you can find on our website. We've got we have 4 toolkits so far that are up here. These are 3 of them. Our version of a toolkit is more of it's a program concept. So we don't believe in the program in a box. We know that all of our communities are different in really beautiful ways. And so we offer up a program idea. So one of them is a music sharing program. There's another that's focused around storytelling through photography. And a third, the Journeys Toolkit, encompasses a lot of different types of arts practices and is designed to engage different age groups, intentionally brought together to share their life journeys, both current and looking to the future. You can find all of these on our website and a whole lot of other resources. Next slide. And then we also, as we had referenced at the beginning, there's 4 common barriers. We are all experiencing one of those 4 or all of those 4. And so one way that we have found to help each other is by connecting. And so we're talking today about connecting individuals. Well, we also connect organizations. And so if you're from an organization or an individual who wants to create an intergenerational program, the network is for you. We meet quarterly, and it's an opportunity to learn together. So we learn about designing programs and evaluating them and finding funding and how to collaborate, how to get around the 4 barriers. And we also connect with each other because that's where we can support each other. We're not in competition here. We're all just trying to create a lot more intergenerational conversations. So on this next slide, I can go to the next one, Alexa. We give you some information on how to sign up. The next meeting is January 25th, and we'll be focusing on collaboration and hearing from the Grandmothers Collective that's based out of Boston and is working internationally. And so we invite you to join us. Next slide. And after this, as we send out the slides, we're also going to be sending out all of these resources and more. So you don't need to jot things down too quickly. But Chris, I'll hand it over to you.
If anybody has any questions, if you'd like to type them into the chat, we could address those now. I don't know if there was anything specific yet brought up, but I think one person asked actually for some examples, if you have any, Haley, on engaging ideas for, like, especially in the workplace, on the typical, like, hi, how are you? Or, just kind of the standard workplace communication of just, how you doing? What's going on? Do you have any other little tips?
Absolutely. Kind of added some things. I think like Rachel and I both wrote something around what's bringing you joy or what's made you happy this week, or especially maybe if it's in a workplace setting, maybe like what's a small win of the week. So some things questions that can both kind of decrease maybe burnout in a workplace and also increase kind of connection and a share of like celebratory moments in the workplace.
Excellent tips. Thank you. Oliver, you have your hand raised?
Yes. One thing that definitely really helped get the attention going, and I've been doing this for the last few months, is protesting on the streets, like saying no to ageism. And the theme that I have came up with is hashtag I look my age. And another theme I've been doing to raise awareness about ageism is called Empowered at 50 plus. So we've been doing it on the streets. And in the beginning, when we were campaigning on the street, lots of people were ignoring it and not looking at the signs. But if you do it a few times, a lot of people started to get interested, but only with a few people. But then I think the more times you do the same thing, more people will come and join. So you might expect if you did the protesting on the street, you only get nobody coming for the first time. And then the next time you get maybe 1 or 2, then you get 10, and you get hundreds, and then you get 1,000.
Building up the momentum, right?
And it does definitely work if you did campaigning. And another thing that might work is doing some guerrilla tactics, such as putting adverts on tubes, bust up billboards. That would be the best way to get the attention going. And doing those guerrilla tactics where you can put things. And if you went to a cafe, you can even get sticky pads and then write some ageist quotes and do something that is not damaging, but you could do tables where you go into the cafe and then decorate tables with different colors. So, yeah.
Thank you, Oliver. Yeah, those are great tips, just to kind of the public health or public perspective, right? Public messaging. There's one other question, Haley, that's asking, what advice do you have when tough political comments may come up at holiday dinners? Any thoughts?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's where those kind of 4 elements of reflective listening can come in. So really taking a moment to kind of calm your body, because a lot of times when those things happen, we may get really heightened because we're really passionate about those views and those values, and someone may have seemingly attacked them. I love that someone brought up the kind of using and instead of but. And so kind of bringing in that both and, if there are situations where a both and perspective may be helpful, and thinking about highlighting the value. So maybe like Rachel was saying, I heard you say that you really value being with others. What about whatever that comment may be? Then asking that point of curiosity, what did you mean by this? Rather than kind of going at it to just trying to butt heads because we may disagree, is trying to get a little deeper about why someone thinks that way, to see if there are values that can align and there can be moments for shared learning, and that we may be able to change, not necessarily going to with it changing someone's mind, though we can if we are kind of connecting on those values, rather than just trying to kind of butt heads.
Yeah, I like that you just brought that up, because one of the things that I am conscious of often is to not have the intention to change someone's mind, because no one can necessarily just change anyone because you want them to change, right? So it's about giving them space to share and feel comfortable to share, and just hearing another perspective. And if your intention is to change someone, then that's probably going to work against you.
Absolutely.
And yeah, there's some great comments in the chat, so definitely it's worth everybody checking those out. But see how, I think we might have a time for another one. Okay.
Yeah, I see one that just popped up. How do you prevent discussing ageism from becoming a political conversation? There are generational divides due to assumptions. And I think, again, some of that reflecting back of values rather than kind of leaning on that us versus them or that division of generations, but recognizing I hear you value this and I also value that, or like that value may have changed. I wonder what context are kind of changing that value, like what different things maybe are coming up, again, coming from that curiosity point. Um, and yeah, someone asked like asking what ageism means. When someone brings up a word that could be othering, or a situation that could be othering, asking what someone means, to see if there's a point of bridging.
I'm going to throw out one other quick thing that was in the chat, that Christine Foster brought up, which is also about the importance of the built environment, to create those spaces for intergenerational conversations. And in particular, she referenced trauma-informed design. So we talk about trauma-informed principles, and Haley, discussed a lot of that today. In terms of our communication, there's also our spaces and how we make those welcoming and friendly and safe places as well too. So I think that's worthy of a whole other conversation too, is how our built environment encourages also what we're talking about today.
Great. And I also see one more that I think will go into some of the resources on the next slide too, about kind of questions that we can ask on the phone, and suggestions for potential friendly caller programs. We're going to share some of those resources in the follow-up, things like time slips, which has a whole list of beautiful questions, really focusing on working with those living with dementia, to kind of center those things. Things like StoryCorps can be a really great way to conduct oral histories in settings you're in. Maybe it's with your family or in relationships, such that someone can come kind of prepared with questions. They can guide you on how to make these questions, and then record it and create this kind of lasting memory. I already mentioned Othering and Belonging Institute and some of the ways that you can use some of those skills to have some of those tough conversations. And then lastly, I really like to use some of these different card decks, which can be kind of a way to bring in a game element to having conversations with people in your life, where you can come up with or use these cards to ask these conversations, to dig a little deeper, to kind of get some different ideas when you're having conversations, whether in person or over the phone, and kind of build some deeper relationships.
Next slide, I think. Oh, and we just wanted to also let everyone know that we'll be sending out a survey link. And on that, we really want to know within it, one of the questions would be about your interest in a more extensive session or workshop, and what your interest there would be. And just let us know what would work for all of you, what's needed out there, what can we do to help to fill that gap. And you'll be getting a follow-up email with all of with a recording of today's session and all of the information and links to all of these different resources. So please stay in touch with us, and we would love to hear from you and what's needed out there in the work that you're all doing. And Rachel and Haley, did you have anything else you wanted to add or think?
I'll just add a quick thank you. We just had such amazing, wonderful response to the registration for this. And we hope you'll respond to that survey because we'd love to meet up with you guys again and go even deeper on all of this. So thank you all for your time and keep an eye out for our follow-up email. Take care, everyone.